Good afternoon, everyone. I am Heather Metcalf, Chief Research Officer at AAAS and PI for the ARC Network. I want to thank you all for registering for this ARC Network webinar. Before we begin, let's take care of a few housekeeping items. So first, I want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants and members of the ARC Network community. We'll be uploading the recording and any related materials into the ARC Network online community platform after the meeting. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, because I know not everyone has gotten to enjoy the pleasures of having meetings over Zoom like the rest of the team has. There are a couple of useful features just to point you to in the app. So first, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options that pop up. In the bottom left side of the screen, you can adjust your microphone and video settings. So that includes muting, unmuting, turning your video on and off, and choosing the source of each of those. In the bottom middle section of the screen, there are some menu options for question and answer, chat, raising your hand, and more. We started the webinar with everyone placed on mute and ask that if you have any questions about Zoom or you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and Aspen, Liz, and I will help you out. If you have any questions for our presenters today, please use a Q&A function and we will address questions directed at the presenters midway through and at the end of the speaker's presentation. Second, I want to share a little bit about the ARC Network. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. As a key segment of our ARC Network community, ARC communities of practice are groups like the Society of Women Engineers, AIM Network, LGBT+ physicists, Society of STEM Women of Color, Do It, Advanced Grantees, and other diversity, equity, and inclusion working groups doing the on-the-ground work of intersectional equity in STEM. They're developing and implementing policies, programs, and practices in academic departments, national labs, scientific and engineering societies, and companies across the country. Now, on to why we're all here today. It's my pleasure to moderate this session with one of our communities of practice, AAAS Sea Change. Sea Change is a comprehensive initiative that features a self-assessment framework to effect sustainable change with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM at U.S. institutions of higher education. It includes a community of allied organizations and individuals, an institute containing DE&I best practices, research and trainings, and an award system for institutional commitment and progress towards systemic change. Here to tell us all about Sea Change are Dr. Beth Ruedi, Sea Change Director of Operations, and Dr. Erin Kahn, Sea Change Program Associate. Dr. Ruedi has been involved in STEM professional society sector for nearly a decade, first serving as the founding director of education and professional development at the Genetics Society of America. There, she helped cultivate an educational mission for GSA, resulting in a complex portfolio of over 20 activities, initiatives, partnerships, and awards, many of which work to address systemic issues underlying the lack of diversity in STEM. In 2016, she joined AAAS, serving under Dr. Shirley Malcom, to direct multiple projects related to STEM literacy, education reform, and diversity and inclusion. Dr. Kahn received a PhD from Georgetown University in cell biology. There, she co-founded the first graduate student group in STEM, focused on advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and served as a student fellow with Georgetown's Women's Alliance. She is currently a member of the Inclusion and Equity Committee for the American Association of University Women. Thank you both for sharing your work with us on today's webinar. I'll pass it over to you to tell us more.
Thank you so much, Heather. And that was a wonderful introduction, better than anything I would have ever been able to pull together myself. I will be starting us off today. I'm Beth Ruedi. As Heather said, I'm the Director of Operations for Sea Change. And we kind of just want this to be an overview of the history of our program, as well as how we think it can align to what you're already doing at your institutions. So we've called this how to advance your STEM equity work, or how to advance your advance. I'm positive that I am not telling you anything that you don't already know when I'm showing you this graphic of the resident population of the United States and then comparing it to the science and engineering workforce in the US. Very obviously, representation in the STEM workforce doesn't match what we see in the US population. But I think something, oh, of course my television is doing things that yeah, this is what happens when you do a webinar at home, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at this, though, I think it does a great job of showing the intersectionality that we're all kind of trying to address in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So you see that white men are overrepresented within the STEM workforce. And then I think a particularly interesting example here, if you are Latino or Latina, you will see that you're underrepresented in the workforce, but for Latina women, it's actually a much larger gap in representation compared to the US Census population. It's also important to note that while I'm talking about gender and race ethnicity, we are well aware that there are so many other factors that contribute to marginalization in STEM, whether it be in higher education or beyond, or even before. That includes the LGBTQIA population, low socioeconomic status, first-generation college student, etc. And we are quite mindful of that. The reason that at Change we've focused on gender and the intersectionality with race and ethnicity is because that's what most of the higher education populations or higher education institutions have actually been gathering data on thus far. Just to underlie the idea that intersectionality is key for consideration, this was just a graphic showing up at the top the population of engineering graduate students. And if you can see, blue is non-Hispanic white, and green is all other race and ethnic groups. And then if you've got dotted lines, that's men, and if you've got solid lines, that's women. And you can see that just generally speaking, in engineering, there is more of a representation of men than women in engineering, but there's that extra additional factor of if you're a woman of color, you're not very well represented at all. And that hasn't been changing all that much over the past couple of years. And then I like to throw in the graph that's at the bottom here, just to show that there's a huge variability in STEM fields. So something the National Academies has been coming out with a consensus study lately showing that Black males are basically disappearing from health and medical fields. And so each field is kind of different and unique in the challenges that they're facing. This is also something that's really interesting, not necessarily in a good way. As Heather was saying, my supervisor at AAAS is Dr. Shirley Malcom. She actually co-authored a report in 1976 that came out of AAAS called The Double Bind, and it was about women of color in STEM. And unfortunately, when you read it today, most of what's in there is still relevant. So that leads us to kind of ask the question of ourselves, if we've been doing this work for 40 years and more, why hasn't the needle moved? And I really like this graphic. It's from a AAAS report published in 1991 showing a model for the evolution of intervention programs. And I know most of us are well acquainted with interventions. We talk about interventions a lot, but I just decided to take a step back and look it up myself a couple of days ago. And the general definition that I saw, I really liked. It was interventions are something that are interrupting the status quo. So it is a program or initiative that's meant to kind of change what we're seeing. The problem is that most of the intervention programs that we see are at the bottom of this pyramid here. So you've got a department or school-based effort sometimes. Oftentimes it's just isolated projects. It's on soft money or grant money, or oftentimes it's volunteer run. So like Heather was talking about before, Erin, I'm sure that when you started the Georgetown program that you were working on, it started off as volunteer-based until you could get some grant money to help fund it. And then this is individual commitment. So you've got a handful of people that are really passionate about this, starting new things. But what happens in those cases, right? What happens if you have an advanced grant and the PI ends up leaving the institution and goes somewhere else? Or you lose your advanced grant money, but you haven't built into your budget anything to sustain the work that was being done. And that's why we're trying to use Sea Change to move intervention programs up this pyramid to structural reform. And that's where you see institutional commitment and you see hard money. So you've got the actual institutions committing some of their funding and budgeting towards these efforts. And then also, Shirley's been calling for systems change for the entire 40 years that she's been working at AAAS. The rest of the world, you know, we all have to catch up to her. But the consensus studies coming out of the national academies over the past decade almost all uniformly call for systemic change, structural change, culture change, change in climate across the board. So if we're wanting to see something different, if we want to see the needle move, we need to actually change the system where we are putting in place all of these different intervention programs. Because a lot of these programs are fantastic, but if we don't have a system that can support them going forward, there's no point in doing them really. So here we come to the part of the story where we're talking about how Sea Change came to be. I don't know how many people who are on the call have heard of Athena Swan over in the UK. It actually started in 1999 as the Athena Project. It was a handful of women who were tired of the lack of gender parity in STEM in higher education in the UK. And it changed very quickly between 1999 and 2005, such that it ended up being taken on by something called the Equality Challenge Unit. It was much bigger than a handful of volunteers could handle running. And that's when it became the Athena Swan Gender Equity Charter in the United Kingdom. And in 2011, the Chief Medical Officer in the UK basically tied funding for medical schools to having a silver level Athena Swan award or above. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that could necessarily happen in the United States, but I will say that that was a huge catalyst for a lot of institutions to look into becoming an Athena Swan award holder. So that ended up affecting quite a bit of change there. In 2015, they established a separate race equality charter. And also in 2015, in Australia, they began piloting their own version of this equality charters process. It's called SAGE. And as all of this was going on, it was also adopted in Ireland in about, I believe, 2013. And 3 women from the United States had gone over to one of the Irish institutions, and they were really impressed with what they saw at Athena Swan. And so they came back to the United States and they approached the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, in the White House. And somebody there said, this is a great idea. This might end up changing the way we do things, but this should probably not sit within the government in the United States. But you should go talk to Shirley Malcom over in AAAS. And so in fact, that is what they did. And that is how Sea Change came to be born. It was officially launched in October of 2017. Why was AAAS a good home for Sea Change? Our mission is that we seek to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. And I like to put all either in italics or pronounce it with italics. It really truly is supposed to be for the benefit of all. And we have a list of goals and objectives that underlie that mission. And honestly, I could make a case that Sea Change applies to every single one of those goals and objectives, but I pulled out the 2 that are the most relevant. We seek to do this by fostering education in science and technology for everyone, and for strengthening and diversifying the science and technology workforce. And that really is what Sea Change is aiming to do. C stands for STEM Equity Achievement, Sea Change. And what we are hoping that it does, what we feel that it does, is provide scaffolding to guide context-specific, voluntary change within institutions that will result in systemic transformation and alignment with the AAAS mission. We'd like to see increased access to and inclusion in STEM education for traditionally underrepresented groups. Perhaps even more importantly, a shift in culture that results in a more diversified workforce with higher retention rates. So, I mean, I think everybody on this call, everybody who's involved in the ARC network, all of us really don't want DEI to be something special. We want it to be something that is considered the norm. And one of the ways to do that is to try to shift what we're doing in higher education so that it does become normative. But importantly, we were using a lot of the scaffolding that the UK had put together, but we needed to make sure that this was going to operate well within the context of the United States. And part of that means that we needed to align it to the expectations of federal and state legal parameters. So what is within the realm of legally permissible, but also what is legally sustainable for an institution. And by that, I mean, if you see what was going on with Harvard Law School and the lawsuit that they just went through, there are a couple of institutions in the University of California system that are either currently being sued or will be sued soon because of diversity statements and the use of those in hiring faculty. And so one of the things that Sea Change tries to do is provide a guideline or a framework for how do you make sure that you're documenting everything that you do and the rationale for what you're doing. So if you find yourself in that case, you can actually make a good case and end up hopefully with a result like Harvard Law School did find that the judge said that diversity was really important and that what they were doing was well within the confines of the law. And then also separately from the UK, they've got the two different gender and race charters, and we knew that we really wanted intersectional identities to be considered from the get-go. And then we were also very happy to see that within the sexual harassment of women consensus study from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, Sea Change was actually one of the recommendations for how do we start to combat this problem of sexual harassment within STEM. And this was for incentivizing change. And so that is what we're hoping that Sea Change will do for our institutions. And for institutions, what we'd like them to see membership within Sea Change is an opportunity to stand up as a member of a global higher education community. So we were talking about Australia and the UK. They're actually starting to pilot something like this in Canada, and New Zealand's talking about this. Japan is thinking about it. Apparently India is also thinking about it. So there's just a lot of interest in this type of mechanism for change. And so if you do publicly commit to a set of principles that we put forth via Sea Change, you are actually also declaring yourself as an institution as part of this higher education community committed to shifting the culture. And with that, my part is over. So I'm super happy to take any questions while I change over from controlling the screen to giving Erin the screen. But I also want to say that you can drop us a line at any time to ask questions. Our email is seachange@AAAS.org. And our website is awesome. I can say that because Erin is the one that updated it, not me. And it's seachange.AAAS.org. And it's got a whole lot more information, some of which Erin is about to share with you. Do we have any questions?
So if folks have questions, feel free to type them into the question and answer box or raise your hand and I can call on you to ask the question.
Beth?
Erin.
I am having a bit of a technical difficulty.
Did you put it in, what am I trying to say? There you go.
Are you seeing presenter mode? Okay.
Nope, not presenter mode.
Okay.
You are good to go. You're not having any technical difficulty at all. You are good, girl.
Great. Okay. Well,
while we're letting people think about questions that they might want to ask of Beth, we'll move on to your part of the presentation, Erin, and then maybe we can have questions for both of you at the end.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So I thank you, Beth, for providing us the overview of the history of Sea Change and what we're really trying to accomplish with this initiative. My section of this webinar will go over the nuts and bolts of what Sea Change is and how it will operate. So we see Sea Change, as you can hopefully see from this graphic, as a virtuous cycle of iterative improvement for institutions of higher education in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are hoping that member institutions, like Beth mentioned, will commit to the Sea Change principles and shift from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. And what we at Sea Change hope to provide these institutions, or member institutions, is the tools to address their campus-specific challenges through our institute, a community of support, and then the awards that will provide recognition to them for undertaking this work. So our community will be hosted on a web-based platform that we're currently building out, and it will have all different types of moderated conversations that the topics of those conversations will be user-driven. So any type of conversation that you'd like to have within the community, we can create sub-communities for those. And for our members, there will be members-only sub-communities where they can talk collaboratively and openly about what they're doing with Sea Change and other initiatives on their campuses in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Institute, or the toolbox for our member institutions, will contain the entire repository of resources, which will include our research repository that'll contain the literature on best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, as well as all of our trainings and webinars. Member institutions will have access to all of that, and non-members can access the trainings and webinars, but on an a la carte basis. So there will be fees associated for non-members. And so two of our institute content rollouts for 2020. The first one is a book launch event for talking about leaving revisited. Our director, Dr. Shirley Malcom, wrote the foreword for this book. Talking About Leaving was published 20 years ago. And so for this launch event, we'll have the authors as well as other subject matter experts come to AAAS, and we'll have an event and hear them speak about what has changed over the past 20 years, but also what hasn't changed. And then there's another study that they've incorporated into Talking About Leaving Revisited, and we'll talk about the findings within that study. And that's actually open to everyone. So we'll be sending out an invitation for that in the coming weeks if you're on our contact list. If you are not on our contact list and you'd like to be invited, I strongly suggest you head over to our website and fill out the contact form so I can make sure we get you the invitation. You can join us in person here, or we'll be streaming it live via GoToWebinar. For members, you'll have access to that webinar after the fact, and we'll also be producing other content surrounding Talking About Leaving Revisited. Our second piece of planned content is a multi-part curriculum around the revised version of the Handbook on Diversity in the Law. And so that handbook is really written for general counsel, but our goal through this multi-part course is to help institutional self-assessment teams get a better understanding of the legal landscape surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, both at the federal level and the state level, so that when they're preparing their action plans for Sea Change Awards, those action plans will remain sustainable over time. Okay, and now the awards are probably what Sea Change is best known for at this point, because the pilot was implemented a few years ago, and we're finally now bringing up the community and the institute to speed. So we know that systemic transformation can't happen unless there are both top-down and bottom-up influences. So when we launched the awards pilot in 2017, we started with the institutional awards, which is our top-down component. So with the institutional awards, we're asking institutions to look at the policies, practices, procedures, and climate across the entire institution, and that will focus primarily on faculty. The awards pilot is still ongoing. 2020 will be our last year of the pilot before we fully launch the institutional awards. The departmental awards are our bottom-up approach. So those awards will look at the same things, the policies, practices, procedures, and climates, but within individual departments. And rather than focusing primarily on faculty, it'll also incorporate student populations, graduate students, and undergrads within those. We are partnering with coalitions of disciplinary society partners who will help us develop and administer discipline-specific departmental awards. That's still in the works, but we're hoping that our first departmental award will be piloted within the next year or so, and that should be with our physics and astronomy working group. Okay, and Beth made this beautiful graphic that really lays out what we're asking for in the awards. So right now we're asking for this with the institutional awards, and then it will be adapted for a departmental. The first thing that any institution will need to do is conduct a very thorough self-assessment using the Change framework. So we provide the scaffolding to help you look at the types of information that you could look at within your institutional self-assessment. There is a list of questions that you could ask of yourselves, of your institutions, but we're not looking for you to answer every single question, nor should you, because there are certain questions that are hitting the nail on the head for what you need to address at your institution, and others might not be relevant for you. We also want to impress that whatever you find, whatever data you collect in your self-assessment, we do not want that. We don't want to collect what you see from your self-assessment. That's for your internal use only. But what will be submitted for peer review for the awards process is the narrative that you develop from your self-assessment, and then the action plan that you're going to put in place going forward. So with the narrative, you want to take what you found in your self-assessment and then tell the peer reviewers the story, set the context for what's going on, tell us what questions you're going to address as you move forward, what questions you're not, and provide rationale for both of those. And then in your action plan, we should see policies, procedures, actionable steps that you're putting in place to move your institutions forward based on what you found in your self-assessment. And so there are a number of related efforts ongoing in colleges and universities. I'm sure you're all very familiar with some of these, including the ARC network, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. The Change framework, and really what we're asking institutions to do with the awards, is a really heavy lift. It is not easy. So we've purposefully designed the framework to be in alignment with the efforts that are already ongoing at colleges and universities. And because the awards are meant to recognize the work that institutions are already doing and are going to continue doing, we want you to include the work that you're doing with these and other efforts within your application. And Change is unique because it really provides a great way for you to explore the effectiveness of these efforts that you've undertaken already. So this is just the layout of what we are asking for bronze, and then as you progress to silver and gold. Each award will last, it's good for up to 5 years, at which point you can reapply or apply to advance to the next level. So as I mentioned, for bronze, you'll need to conduct the thorough self-assessment using the qualitative and quantitative analyses. show that you have an understanding of the underlying issues that are contributing to the challenges on your campus, and then give us an action plan that shows that you are putting actions in place that will help your institution move forward. For silver, you'll do all the work of the bronze, but then we are also looking for evidence of effective practices. And then gold, all the work of bronze, all the work of silver, and then also a demonstration that your institution is serving as a beacon for change. We are adapting the whole sea change process for health science centers and medical schools. We've partnered with the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health and the Center for Women in Academic Medicine and Science. That we have a wonderful team member named Dr. Darla Thompson, who is spearheading this initiative. And so she's been with us about 2 months. So it's very new, but she's doing great. But we're hoping to get Change Biomedicine launched within the next 2 to 3 years. So that's good to keep in mind. Beth, have I missed anything?
No, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I see that there are a couple of questions, which is great.
Yeah, thank you both so much. We do have 2 questions so far, and for the rest of you, feel free to type in the question and answer box if you have anything that you would like to ask of our presenters. The first question that we have comes from Monica Kessel, who asks, how is Sea Change connected to the ARC network?
Well, we're best friends. One of the things that we've been trying to do with Sea Change, we don't want to be duplicative. We don't want people to be reinventing the wheel over and over again. I think we're all kind of sick of things that do that. And so we're constantly trying to interface and speak with people that are working on similar initiatives to make sure that we're all interconnected in whatever way we possibly can. And so I think that for the ARC network, it started off as advanced grant institutions, but it grew much larger than that, if I'm correct, right, Heather?
Yes,
so
that's right.
A lot of the people that are going to be involved in Sea Change are going to be people that are involved in the ARC network as well. So one of the things that we're going to be exploring as we're developing our IT infrastructure is how is the best way to interface with ARC network so that we're not recreating something that already exists. And that we are making something that brings value to the space instead of just duplicating the efforts that everybody at ARC Network is already doing. I think that was it. ARC Network, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would just agree with what you've said. So we see Sea Change as a great partner organization for the work that we're doing, as well as a community of practice that people can turn to get resources from. So a big part of the ARC network is to not only curate resources, but have members of the community sharing those resources with one another. And so I think the work that Sea Change is doing to incentivize change at academic institutions is really important. And actually, one of the questions that I had for you, Beth and Aaron, is knowing that you have a lot of background research that has informed your efforts, if you wouldn't mind, sharing how that process looked where you designed this nationwide effort at academic institutions for people who may be thinking about doing a parallel effort or wanting to incorporate some of those things into their organizations.
So I wish I could say that I was more of an expert on like change management type related things. I will say that the good folks over at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities who are working on something called the Aspire Alliance and the Institutional Change Initiative within that, they actually have a couple of people working on that initiative who come from a PhD in higher education background and have a lot of change background and change initiative there. So that's good to kind of keep in mind. In general, for us, it's just kind of been more of a working with United States stakeholders and working with the UK and all of that they have learned over the 15 years that they've been doing their equity charters. and trying to align things in such a way that it made sense for the United States, while also using what we know from change literature, meaning that it does need top-down and bottom-up pressure. You can't have somebody from the administrative level saying you need to do this and then have faculty not buy into it. But if you've got a good number of faculty or a good number of students that think that this is a good idea, they can actually do grassroots efforts from the bottom up and start to really incentivize change on that end. One of the reasons that we're putting together the Sea Change Institute is for exactly the reason that you were saying. Oftentimes people want to do these efforts and they have no idea where to look to find the research that underlies this. And so, you know, kind of where it's great. I know from my past life, I know a whole lot about Drosophila melanogaster mating behavior, right? But that doesn't mean that I necessarily understand what the problems are within behavior genetics and gender equity, for instance. But I would definitely want to know where to go to find that, and also to know like which journals are the ones that you should be looking at. And you know, I know that there's a book chapter that's coming out in the spring, and I think it might actually already be available online. That's basically talking about the faculty diversity and all of the different pressure points that research has found that underlie the issues behind lack of diversity within faculty. And I'll stop talking there because I see a bunch of other questions coming in, and I'm trying to write an answer to the one that's in the Q&A.
Yeah, so we can move over to that one next. So Jazara Otu asks, when will the departmental framework be announced?
And that's an interesting question. And so we're hoping that there will be a core framework that will be available within the next year or two. But the timing of how it's going to roll out for departments is going to depend on which field you're talking about. Because as Erin was saying, this is kind of coalitions of disciplinary societies coming together, deciding kind of by inventorying their members and from what they already know of their field, what parts of that framework to enhance and to kind of make a little bit more intensive. And then they're going to kind of roll that out when they're ready to start piloting. So as Erin mentioned, physics and astronomy is likely to start piloting some of their departmental work, just kind of test it out, see what they've got going on in the fall of this year. At least that's the plan. And then we know geoscience is working together to try to craft a similar type of working group initiative. Erin, did you want to add anything else?
No, I think you got everything related to the departmental awards.
Great, thanks. Another question that we have is from Danielle Tan, who asks, are any similar initiatives planned for industry?
Yes, our hope is to be able to spread this into industry. As to when we'd be able to do that, I would hazard a guess like somewhere between 5 to 10 years. I always have to keep reminding myself that Sea Change is a baby initiative. And so while we have very big plans and big goals, and we want to include research labs as soon as possible and industry partners as soon as possible, and kind of tailor self-assessment frameworks depending on what each one of those sector needs. We also need to make sure that it's working right for the institutions of higher education first. So I would say to put a pin in that, but that has always been our plan and our hope.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have a series of questions from Delia. Delia, it's nice to see that you're on here. Delia was at our stakeholder convening early when ARC was in its infancy. So,
yay.
So Delia's asking, does Sea Change provide funding to promote change, or do institutions seek their own resources?
Mm-hmm. This is a very common question, and thank you for asking it. So we don't currently provide seed funding for this. We ask the institutions to allocate some of their own resources as a way of showing that this is a priority for them, and or there are several avenues, especially through Advance, that institutions can try to receive funding to go for a Sea Change Award and to become a member of Sea Change. And that's one of those things that I keep meaning to do that I have not yet done is Jesse Darrow from NSF was kind enough to put together just kind of a scoping document that said, you know, here are the different avenues of funding that you can get via advance, and here are the ways that this could end up interfacing with Sea Change in particular. And she gave me permission to share that, and I just haven't put it on a document to share it with the world. But we're hoping that this doesn't become such a huge lift that institutions can't participate in it, but we also do want institutions to take ownership of this type of change, because the change literature shows that if you don't, it ends up being kind of at the bottom of that intervention pyramid that I was showing at the beginning of the webinar.
Thank you. Delia has a couple of other questions. One has to do with whether the self-assessment dimensions or questions for each level that you posted for the awards are actually on your website.
So we do have the framework for the bronze. Because it's going to take institutions a while to even get to silver, we haven't even posted what we have for that yet. We have found that the criteria and guidelines for the bronze is scary to look at, apparently, which is one of the reasons that I put together that infographic that you saw, where it was like the self-assessment, which is what you should do on your own, and you should do it and do it thoroughly. But then what we expect you to actually put in for peer review is different. And we're still trying to kind of suss out what is the best way to present all of that information. So it is available on the website, but if you open it up, you might be terrified. So don't be scared, and always arrange to have video calls with us instead of freaking out. That's my advice in that. And then I see also she was asking about the repository contents. We don't know the answer to that yet. So we're just beginning to develop the Institute repository. And so
I'm going to repeat the question real quick, Beth,
yes,
just in case
so
everybody
sorry.
can't
Yep.
see it. No, it's okay.
Absolutely.
So the question is, are the repository contents grouped by area of change, for example, climate versus recruitment or gender versus race, or is there a continuous bibliography or relevant works?
Yes, and so I think we're probably going to start asking members of the community, including the ARC community, how would you like to see things presented to you? And I forget what, Shirley's got a favorite website that I never remember what it's called, but it's got this really cool infographic kind of hovery, it's like a network hub with a repository of information, and you can kind of click around on it, and it'll have areas of research and how they're kind of interrelated to one another, and it's kind of a cool way to look at it.
Digital Promise?
Digital Promise, yes. So it's worth looking at their repository and kind of the way that they present that. That's just one of the many different ways that we're thinking about doing that sort of thing. But I would say watch this space. And if you see us asking questions, definitely contribute to it.
Thank you. I know that was a thing that we thought about a lot for the ARC network, is how to organize the repository. And so we ended up, it was part of what we talked about with a variety of our stakeholders and tested out. And we have not only organization around different topic areas, but we created a series of tags because sometimes you might have, you know, it's a climate issue, but it's related to both gender and race. And so you want to see those kinds of articles or those kinds of resources. And so we developed a whole taxonomy for how we're organizing that, that can still be a work in progress with feedback from the community. So I think your approach to hearing from everyone.
Maybe we should use yours first as a base.
Sure, yeah.
And then not reinvent the wheel, because that would be silly.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, it's a lot of work to try to define that, and then also make it so that it's not stuck. So there are so many websites where they're just like, this is the taxonomy and that's what we have now. And I'm like, that's not how we want things to work.
Exactly. We have another question from Josie, who's wanting to know, what do you do when one part of the equation doesn't work for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in particular, if you're having trouble getting leadership buy-in or faculty buy-in, or the work happening at the grassroots level, or one part of that isn't working out, what do you do?
That is a really interesting question, and there is an entire body of research around answering that question. So when I say that the folks over at APLU are more expert in this than I am, that is the exact realm that they are more expert than I am. But there are ways of approaching this from a change management standpoint, and that includes trying to figure out the people that are going to end up saying no before they say yes, and putting a plan in place. How are you going to respond to detractors or to people that don't ever want to do this from the get-go? So for instance, some of our campuses are trying to implement some initiatives or some practices that are really great for increasing faculty diversity, but the other faculty on campus don't necessarily like it, nor have they bought into it all the way. And so it's just kind of, how do you manage that risk? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of situation for this. It's just kind of what is going to speak the best to that particular risk or that particular population, and how best to include them in the conversation. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Eleni Dalla, who's joining us from Greece.
Hello from the United States.
The question is, if you think that the debate societies and the use of a balanced scorecard could help in order to reduce the underrepresentation of women in academic science, and particularly in the 3 levels of higher education studies, undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD level for STEM.
Yeah, so there are a lot of disciplinary societies that have things like equity scorecards, or for instance, there's the American Society for Engineering Education. They have a Dean's Initiative that is looking at diversity. And so what we're trying to do is make it so that no matter what your department or your institution has been involved in, you can use that information and the work that you've already done to put towards your award application. So I do think that scorecards of sort can kind of help you get to where you need to go. The reason that I don't particularly love scorecard as the end-all be-all is because it's frequently kind of a counting exercise. So it's just looking at quantitative things. And so the framework for sea change is quantitative, also qualitative. So it's not just, do you have a diversity statement, but it's, does your diversity statement cover X, Y, Z? How often do you look at it? Who's involved in crafting it? Just a lot of questions about the diversity statement instead of just saying, do you have one? Which is the frequent on scorecards is like, do you have one? Yes or no, check.
Thank you. That's all of our questions from the audience for right now. Folks, feel free to write in any other questions that you have. While we're waiting, I have another question for you.
Oh, yes, please.
I'm really curious if you could share with us some of the lessons that you're learning from your pilot phase, since it's getting to the end of it.
I think being clearer about what we're asking for has been a learning experience from both ends. So basically trying to convey that what the peer reviewers want to look at is not a laundry list of all of the different things that your institution has been doing over time, but instead it's more of a narrative, like if you were going to publish a paper. So back to my fruit fly mating behavior, which I keep going back to lately. I don't know why. Maybe I should get back in the lab for a day or two and just get that out of my system. But if I were to try to publish a paper that just listed, you know, all of the methods that I used and the strains that I used, but didn't put it in context or describe anything about the results that I then presented, that wouldn't be particularly useful, and it wouldn't pass muster with a peer review publication. Same basic idea for these awards is that what they're looking for is, what is the context for your institution or your department? What are your particular challenges? what do you understand or you think you understand that's underlying some of the things that you found? And then what's going to make the most sense for you to tackle first, and how are you going to tackle it? Because a lot of times it's going to be, here's why we prioritize things the way that we did. We can only really focus on these 2 things over the next 5 years because we just simply don't have the resources to do anything other than that. And the peer reviewers are like, I understand, and I am excited to hear your story, basically. So I think that's the biggest lesson learned. And then communication between staff and the institutions is critical. So now we, if they're going for awards, we make them look at our mugs once a month, every month, until they turn in their application. So they have to check in with us, even if it's just to say, hey, we don't have anything to ask. But that touching base is really critical, I think, for kind of being a catalyst moving things forward.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have another audience question from Kelly Flattalt, who is asking, what evaluation requirements are you making part of this, and how are institutions going to measure systemic change?
I think that's
she's adding the context
question.
that she's been on advanced grants in the past and has been a program evaluator for 20 years. So
we're going to adopt you, Kelly. I'm going to adopt you. We were actually just talking about how we're going to measure milestones for sea change as a whole. One of the things that we're asking institutions and departments to do, yes, Kelly's ready to be adopted. It's amazing. We're asking when they're putting together their action plan, to think about leading and lagging indicators. So what are the things that you can kind of measure first, and then what are the things that you want to measure in the long term? For kind of each one of their actions within the action plan. And so it's, again, it's not an easy lift for them, but this is the way that we know that they're going to be able to measure their success, and they're setting themselves up to be able to go for a silver award sooner rather than later. Because if you already have your metrics laid out and you know who's going to be collecting it, how you're going to be collecting it, then it's just a matter of remembering to do it. And then once you've done that, you've collected the information that you need in order to demonstrate that you've actually made some progress using your actions. In terms of like actually evaluating sea change as a whole, that's a whole other different question. And we're going to start working with some of our internal AAAS evaluators and maybe Kelly, I don't know, to kind of talk through what our big milestones are. So we're going to try to figure out how to approximate the idea that we're seeing change before we can actually see the change, right? So in the UK, it took them 14, 15 years to actually start to see the needle move. But there's plenty of things that you can measure before then. Importantly, for the institutions and the departments, one of the reasons we're asking them to do all of this work on their end is that the ownership is really a big part of why we end up seeing the needle move. Them taking ownership, them doing what's right for their campus, and them kind of like learning the ropes is a huge, huge component of this.
Thank you. Kelly adds, yes, most institutions find it hard to measure culture change. You can do it, but they need a specific skill set. So kind of echoing what you're saying there.
Or like sometimes they do a culture survey and then they're like, I have no idea what to do with that information. So we actually had a workshop, an in-person workshop in the fall, and I think part of the Institute is going to be one of those presentations was from a woman named Becky Packard, who does a lot of work on climate and culture. And that is one of the kind of questions is, okay, we did this climate survey, what in the heck do we do with this information? Because it's so complicated and it's really hard to do. But yeah.
Another question from Delia, does the book you mentioned earlier, Handbook on Diversity in Law, cover specific states' laws in addition to federal law, or does it provide mostly a general overview?
It does, but I will say that it is also written in legalese, which is part of why we're doing the Institute component of it as it's being revised. So if you do have a legal background, it should be fairly easy to digest. But I know all of your institutions also have general counsel, so they'll also be able to digest it in a way and kind of communicate it to folks that don't have legal expertise. But it does have state laws as well as federal law. And that is available on our website, and I'll make sure to get the URL to you, Heather, so that we can share it in the ARC network.
Great, thank you. Donna Barron asks, can you give some concrete examples of leading and lagging indicators to the metrics that we were talking about earlier?
So a good example maybe of a leading indicator would be the kind of pre and post survey for, say, an implicit bias training that you've done for your new faculty hiring committees. So if you're seeing some changes there and you're seeing some changes in how those committees are planning on going about doing new faculty hires, that's a leading indicator. So that's an indicator that like things are starting to change. A lagging indicator there would actually be an increase in the diversity of your faculty. So that's going to take a lot longer to see, and that's really going to be something that you kind of see whether or not it worked kind of after the fact. And so that's the reason why leading indicators are so important, is that you can kind of take the temperature of what's going on and see if you're doing if your hunch was right, because all of this is a big experiment, right? You're like, I really do think that our faculty is less diverse because there's implicit bias in the way that our new hire committees are conducting their work. If you were wrong about that, it's good to know that earlier on. So if you're not seeing any significant changes, the more training that you do, that's probably not the thing that was causing the lack of diversity in that area. Hopefully that helped.
Thank you. Ashley Garcia is asking a clarifying question. Is there a monetary stipend attached to the awards once people win them, or is it a certification? How does that work?
I would love to provide monetary stipends, but right now we're just trying to figure out how to become sustainable and build capacity ourselves. So really the way that we consider the awards is kind of the cherry on top of the work that you're already doing. And it will be a recognition that is in place for about 5 years. So you can either reapply or you can apply to go to silver or to gold whenever you're ready to do that. And I wish that we had all the money in the world and that we could give each institution little nest eggs and be like, okay, let's go do these things. But alas, that's not the way the world works.
Thank you. One of the last questions that I think I'll ask, since we don't have any others in our chat box or in our Q&A, is if there's one last lesson or takeaway that you want our audience to have from the work that you do, and maybe we can start with Erin and then go to Beth as we wrap up.
Beth, why don't you go first?
Man, one takeaway. I think one. I mean,
you've shared a lot already.
Yeah,
right?
I'm a chatterbox. I'm sorry. I think that we're all in this together, and we all want things to change. And so while we're very committed to making sure that we're working with the good folks of the ARC network, we'd also love to hear from you directly what your institution needs or what your department needs, and know that you're not floating out there alone.
Yeah, I will echo that in terms of all of us here at AAAS and then all of you who are working to bring sea change to your institutions. But as was mentioned earlier, I am super fresh out of grad school, and I also just want to stress that people at your institutions, whether they're vocalizing it or not, probably really want this to happen too. They want these changes to come about, and yeah, we have to all work together to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much for your time and for sharing the great work that you've been doing with our audience. And thank all of you in the audience for attending. We appreciate you being here, and we will share this recording shortly, along with any resources that Beth and Erin share with us afterwards. I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Bye.